Let's move ahead for a keynote address by Rory Sutherland, Vice Chairman, Ogilvy UK. Rory is an expert on consumer behavior, trends, and the influence of the internet. He analyzes what branding means, what creativity is, and the value of persuasion over compulsion. He is also technology correspondent for The Spectator, the world's oldest English language magazine. He is the author of Alchemy, The Surprising Power of Ideas That Don't Make Sense. Welcome, Mr. Sutherland.
Hello, I'm going to start off with all of you with a provocation, which is, are you as marketers as brave as Henry Ford? Do you have the same insight as the Hawaiian Shirt Manufacturers Association? Are you ready to make the same kind of leap as actually the Indian tea industry in the early part and later part of the last century? Because here's an interesting question. When we ask business questions, we tend to ask, how do we want our employees to behave? Because we have direct control over our employees. That's our decision. That's our responsibility. But there are a few interesting cases, some of them true, some of them perhaps anecdotal, where companies have gone further. They've asked a different question, which is, in the interests of our business, how do we want our customers to behave? And that's ultimately what marketing is all about. And so I think, and this is a provocative thought, that marketers might have missed one of the bigger opportunities of life post-COVID. And let me explain with a few stories. In Britain, there was a kind of conspiracy theory, or it was perhaps an urban myth. It might have had an element of truth in it, that a practice about 15 years ago of dress down Fridays was created by Unilever or perhaps Procter & Gamble. And the theory goes like this, that Procter & Gamble or Unilever encourage staff to dress casually on a Friday, because if people wear casual clothes, they use more laundry detergent than if they wear formal clothes. A suit tends to be dry cleaned or not cleaned at all, whereas chinos, for example, and polo shirts tend to go into a washing machine. And the theory ran that P&G stroke Unilever kind of instigated the practice of dress down Fridays in order to sell more detergent. Now, is it true or is it not true? We don't know. What we do know is that there are cases of precisely this happening. So in the 1940s, the Hawaiian shirt industry encouraged Hawaii to adopt Aloha Fridays, which is a case where essentially you were allowed to wear a Hawaiian shirt on Friday to work. Whether you worked for the government, whether you worked in an office, Fridays were Hawaiian shirt days. And that was done to help out the Hawaiian shirt industry, because the more opportunity people had to wear your products, the more products you could sell. It's certainly true that Henry Ford instigated the two-day weekend for his workers, because he realized that actually if people had a two-day weekend, it might be worth them buying a car. And he thought, well, if Ford's two-day weekend starts spreading to the rest of American industry, in other words, it's the 5-day week rather than the 6-day week, it'll be worthwhile for ordinary working people to buy their own automobile. In India, they instigated the tea break. It probably benefited worker productivity, but that wasn't the main point. The main point that the tradition of the tea break was instigated was encouraged actually by the tea industry to get people into the habit of drinking more tea. And I think it's worth remembering that we always love to debate flexible working and remote working from the standpoint of, yes, but is it more productive or less productive than traditional working where everybody has to come into an office 5 days a week? And before I talk about the changing role of brands after COVID, I think we should look at this question slightly differently and say, never mind whether we want our employees to work remotely or flexibly. Do we want our customers to be able to work flexibly? And there, I think the answer is a resounding yes. Because if you look at consumer disposable income, in large cities in particular, an extraordinarily high amount of people's disposable income isn't really disposable. In London, among my younger staff, of their after-tax income, 50% disappears in accommodation costs and transportation costs. And I said to Mark Reed, who's the chief executive of WPP, I said, let's be absolutely honest here, okay? Unless your client is Transport for London or a transport company, or perhaps a big landowner like the Duke of Westminster in London, unless your client is a central London sandwich shop, okay, all those people will suffer through flexible working, but all our other clients stand to gain because marketers are in the business of chasing disposable income. Discretionary income is our stock in trade. You know, where spending is non-discretionary, there's no role for marketing. And my question is this: if we can at a stroke increase the amount of discretionary income in the economy by perhaps 10 or 15%, that's in effect equivalent to an enormous tax cut in terms of how much money people have available to spend. And so the first question I asked was a different question. Before we start asking about what we want our employees to do, there's a much bigger question of what will we like our customers to be able to do. And for nearly all brands, in other words, if you're not in the business of commuter transportation, and you're not necessarily perhaps in the gasoline industry, we could argue, but for most of our clients, if we can actually increase the sum total of disposable income that's available, that has to be good news. And so I would argue that as marketers, we have a wider duty to promote the continued use of flexible working after the pandemic ends, simply because it means there's more money for marketers to chase. And there's more money available. Personally, if I were in a leisure category in the United States, the first thing I'd try and do is encourage Americans to have 4 weeks paid holiday rather than the meager 2 weeks they get at the moment, because the hotel industry and all those hospitality industries would benefit inordinately if Americans had more leisure time. And in the same way, I think if we're giving people more discretionary time and we're giving them more discretionary income, that's a triumph for marketing. Before we've even had the debate about is it 3% less productive than working in the old way. So I think this is actually a very, very important opportunity to return money away from things people had to spend their money on but didn't want to, towards things that they can choose. And just as the tea break, I think, benefited both parties, I think it led workers to become more productive, but it also sold a lot of tea. I think we can achieve the same thing here. The second thing we have to look at, I suppose, is what else is different for marketers after lockdown. For some categories, I suspect things won't change all that much. You can never say that confidently, however, because there are enormous knock-on effects. You know, marketing, the market, is a complex adaptive system. And when people spend more money on one thing over there, it generally changes what they spend elsewhere. There are always knock-on effects, substitution effects, and everything else. So it's very difficult confidently to say that your category is going to be unaffected. What's probably fair to say is that some categories will be affected more than others by the behaviors that remain sticky after the lockdown ended. There are lots and lots of cases, by the way, where a single synchronous stimulus leads to lasting change, even if the stimulus itself is temporary. In the UK, the adoption of the fax machine rocketed back in the 1980s because there was a series of postal strikes. So people had to find an alternative quickly, and having found the alternative, this is very true of network goods, the benefit to a fax grew inordinately when you knew that every other business you dealt with had a fax, and that behavior stuck even after the postal strike had ended. This is the same thing on a much, much larger scale, because it's gone on for a year and a half. It's affected everybody simultaneously, and it's created new habits. So one of the things I always say is that, video conferencing before the lockdown was a bit of an outlier. It was an anomaly. It was like asking for a Dr. Pepper, not a Coke. It used to be that business travel and commuting were Coca-Cola and video conferencing was Dr. Pepper. I think that's been reversed. So the interesting question you've also got to ask is what changes? Well, one thing that would change in, for example, the quick service restaurant category is your brand is much more relational if you're in the delivery business. Because there is a different nature to a brand relationship where it isn't just a question that you know the brand, you also know that the brand knows you. So Amazon has spotted this very early, that service brands do have that different category, that different quality about them, where it isn't just that they're celebrity brands, where everybody knows the celebrity, but the celebrity doesn't know them. If you're in a service business, if you're in a business where you're ordering things for delivery, where you have a direct two-way relationship with the brand, that is fundamentally different. Because it isn't a celebrity anymore, it's also, at the very least, an acquaintance or a friend or a partner. And suddenly people start asking different questions. It isn't just what do I think about the brand, it's actually what does the brand think about me? I remember speaking to the managing director of Starbucks in the UK, who always said that was the best thing he ever heard from a marketer, that if you're in a service business, it doesn't just matter what the people think about you, what they think you think about them becomes equally important. And we have to understand that brands there are built by behaviors, they're built by habits, but they're also built by basic assumptions, about how you behave and how you treat your customers and how you treat your customers differentially. In the old world, nobody expected Unilever to know who they were. In the new world, if we have a case of more direct delivery and more direct relationships, that changes quite significantly. So that's one change. Where do we expect the change to manifest itself? Well, that's going to be different. John Quelch, the former dean of the Harvard Business School, makes the distinction that there are four kinds of categories of good. There are essentials, there are treats, there are postponables, and there are optionals. Essentials are things like food, sustenance, basic things like that, for which demand is generally fairly stable, and they tend to be bought fairly much on price. Treats are much more complicated. We don't necessarily want to pay as little as possible for a treat, particularly if we're signaling generosity. So those would be the kind of weekly or infrequent purchases that we do to make ourselves and other people feel special. They aren't in the business of basic utility. Postponables, the car industry has probably seen a lot of postponement of replacement and repurchase during lockdown, simply because you do need to replace a car eventually, but quite often you don't need to do it immediately. So you might see, as I think you've seen all over the world, a sudden surge in demand for secondhand cars, precisely because so many people postponed car replacement at a time of uncertainty. And John Quelch, what we might call entirely optional goods would be things like expensive holidays and cruises, where we won't necessarily spend more to catch up on a postponed expenditure, and where our behavior may have been indelibly changed, our tastes may have been indelibly changed. Which leads me, I think, to the final message, which I think is important, which is no matter which category you're in, you have to test more and you have to experiment more. Now, in AI, in animal foraging, in various areas of science, very true in machine learning, there's something which is called the explore-exploit trade-off. And it's the acknowledgement that there is always a trade-off between investment you make in efficiently exploiting that which you already know from the past, and investment in exploration, which is finding out what you don't know, either because you haven't discovered it yet or because it wasn't true a year ago. Now, all I have to say to marketers is that we need to fight against this fanatical obsession with marketing efficiency and accountability, because at this moment, we need to explore a bit more and exploit a bit less. And the reason is something that the great Canadian business writer, Roger L. Martin, whose work I really commend to all of you, he makes the point that when people first go to school, the first thing they're taught about statistics is that if there's something unrepresentative about your sample, you have to tread very carefully. And if possible, you have to try and counterbalance the biases and the selectivity in your sample. Now, the problem with demanding that marketing become wholly data-driven is that there is an unrepresentativeness problem in all data. And it can be encapsulated in this one sentence. All big data comes from the same place. It comes from the past. And inevitably, you have much, much more data about the past than you do about the future. And it is sometimes a catastrophically dangerous mistake to optimize on the past rather than optimizing on the future. Now, those of you who've heard me talk before have probably heard me mention this fact that bees don't all obey the waggle dance. They have this wonderful waggle dance, which tells them where, to the best of their knowledge, there is a source of pollen or nectar. And it encourages them to follow that dance so that the bees travel, rather than wasting any time in fruitless search, the bees travel to where there's a known source of nectar or pollen. And then they looked at bees in more detail and discovered a large percentage of them, it varies, don't do that. They actually travel off at random. And they said it's very strange because bees have been around for 20 million years. And you would have thought that bee evolution would have produced kind of bee compliance officers who would say, we need 100% compliance with the waggle dance to bring our nectar collection target in line with our forecast for Q3. But this doesn't happen. There are these indulged bees that go off and travel at random. And they looked at it not analytically, they looked at it systemically. They looked at it through a synthetic viewpoint, and they realized that the random bees are actually essential to the survival of bees. Two reasons why. If you don't have random bees, you get trapped in a local maximum, you get optimized on the past, and when the environment changes, you starve to death because you run out of new sources of pollen. The second problem is if you don't have the random bees, you never make a lucky discovery, you never have a lucky accident. And one of the most important things in business is not just optimizing on what you already know, it's maximizing, as my friend Nassim Taleb would say, maximizing your surface area exposure to possible upside good fortune or opportunity. And without the random bees, you never get lucky. You never discover this freak new source of pollen that nobody knew about and that your competing bees and competing hives don't know about. You never have a chance to get lucky because all you're doing is optimizing on the past. And this is an example in nature of the exploit-explore trade-off. But here's the interesting thing. If the environment changes, if there's rapid environmental change, you need to explore a little bit more and exploit a little bit less, because your knowledge about the past, which is derived from the past, has suddenly become a less reliable guide to the future, and certainly to the medium-term future. Because in the short term, simply optimizing efficiency pays. In the next 3 days, if all bees obeyed the waggle dance, the bees would, in those 3 days, collect more nectar and pollen. The reason they don't do that is because, yes, it would make them more efficient in the short term, but it would make them disastrously at risk and vastly less effective in the medium to long term. And we need to understand that much better, that if you purely optimize on short-term gains, you'll place too high a priority on efficiency and too low a priority on discovery. And so one thing marketers need to do is they need to ring-fence testing budgets. I think there's been a tragedy with digital marketing because it's all around transactional optimization. It's how can we optimize conversion? But if you look at digital as a medium, the magic strength of digital is exploration and discovery. And yet digital, because it's highly measured, gets treated very, very heavily with an efficiency lens. Actually, a certain percentage of your digital marketing shouldn't work, because if all your digital marketing is working, you're not experimenting enough. A degree of failure within digital marketing is actually a necessary condition of using digital marketing to its full and effective extent. And we're not very good at this. We're not very good at actually introducing intelligent inefficiencies or deliberate slack into a system. R. Edwards Deming, the great guru of Japanese manufacturing, said, in any system, there is an optimal level of slack and flexibility, and that level is never zero. In the same way, I think we're making a mistake in digital marketing because we're optimizing it around its value in terms of exploitation rather than its value in terms of exploration. And digital is brilliant for exploration because you can fail fast, you can experiment small, you can experiment cheaply. The way you bonus your digital marketers should not be exclusively on the conversion rate. It should be the extent to which 5 times a year they bring you a significant insight about the customer or market behavior that you never knew and you never imagined. And instead, because of our love of direct metrics and only bonusing that thing that you can perfectly quantify, we've used digital marketing, and I think to an extent we've wasted it. And one of the interesting things I think you notice here is that the marketing you see online, because it's optimized around high margin, high attribution businesses, what you see online, advertised online, doesn't bear much relation to how you spend your money. I never see any advertising for P&G or Unilever or detergents or products of that kind online, even though I spend money on those things every month. But if I go and buy a small niche, high margin premium product online, I will see advertising for that thing endlessly and repetitively ad nauseam. So everything's being optimized around the wrong thing. It's not optimized around the customer. It's not optimized around discovery. It's simply optimized around profit maximization, as a result of which we've created a completely unrepresentative advertising ecosystem in digital, where high margin, bought direct, highly attributable impulse products are very heavily advertised, whereas non-impulse, repeatedly bought, lower margin, sold through an intermediary, lower attribution products get absolutely no airtime at all. So a definition of efficient or effective marketing should be that consumers see advertising roughly in proportion to where their money goes, and we haven't even managed to achieve that. So that's my final point, that I think that digital has been a bit of a tragedy. I think what's happened is we should have been actually optimizing around a large part of discovery. And instead, we've bonused people on simply effective short-term conversion. Now, here's the worry here. If you're optimizing your targeting on the ads that work best, the ads that work best will probably be discounts. Because I was a copywriter for 25 years, it's very difficult for me to beat that line, you know that thing you wanted to buy anyway, well, you can now buy it for less, okay? So if that becomes your most effective creative, and then you optimize targeting around your most effective creative, all you're actually doing is perfecting your ability to reach people who buy on discount and buy on price. The job of marketing is to find people who weren't thinking of buying your product and to get them to buy it at full price. That's when a marketer has really succeeded. The job of digital marketing has been optimized around finding people who are probably going to buy your product anyway and selling it to them a bit sooner for a discount. Now, there's nothing wrong with doing that. Okay, it's a great thing to do, bringing sales forward, overcoming inertia. James Webb Young cites that as one of the 7 functions of advertising, is simply overcoming inertia and getting people to do things quickly and getting people to do things now. It's an important part of marketing and advertising, but it's not the whole game, and it shouldn't become the whole game. So I can't predict what will happen post-COVID to your marketplace, because it will be different to everybody. And even if you tell me what your marketplace is, I think there will be unpredictable and unexpected knock-on effects from adjacencies. You know, I could probably predict that if flexible working becomes more popular, razor blade sales will probably fall. Sales of suits will probably fall. It might in the long term be bad news for, city centre property developers to some degree. Okay, I might be able to make those, but actually so often the predictions we make are the opposite of the truth or have unintended consequences. I'm genuinely not sure what to say. Don't forget that in 1995, a friend of mine who worked in Silicon Valley went and bought property next to a lake in Nevada because he thought with the internet in 5 years' time, everybody was going to be working from, lakeside ranch property anyway. In the end, what happened for the next 20 years is that everybody bought property in central San Francisco instead. The opposite happened to what you might reasonably have predicted. Maybe the same thing will happen now. One friend of mine says that weirdly flexible working makes living in cities actually better because you have more time to appreciate what the city has to offer. Never occurred to me to look at it like that. I can't predict. But the one thing I can predict is we just need to test more. Simple as that. We need to optimize on the past less, and we need to experiment more, because the past is always a slightly dangerous guide to the future. It works in the short term, usually, if you don't have a major disruption. If you're locked in a cellar by a psychopath and the man says to you, if you can't tell me what the weather's like outside, I'm going to kill you, but if you get it right, I'll let you free. The best answer to that question of what's the weather like outside, if you've been locked in a cellar for 5 years, is the same as yesterday. Because about 65% of the time you'll be right. In the short term, optimizing on the past pays off. In the longer term, in any dynamic and adaptive system like a marketplace, it looks like an efficiency, but it turns out to be a cost. So that's my one prediction. The people who win will be the people who experiment more, but also who experiment more creatively, more widely, and more counterintuitively. Because to end on one of my aphorisms, test counterintuitive things because your competitors won't.
Thank you, Mr. Sutherland, for a wonderful talk. Now we'll take a short break. Dear viewers, we have an expo area on this platform where our partners' booths are set up. You can proceed to the area to explore the important videos and presentations shared by them.